welcome to China Forum, the leading program for discussing the latest in trends and development in modern Chinese culture, politics, economics, and social issues. My name is Shannon Tiezi, and I'll be your moderator for our program today. Today on China Forum, we'll be discussing the crisis in Syria, the possibility of international action, and China's role. We're happy to welcome two experts today to answer all of our questions. First, we're joined by Ambassador Chaz Freeman. Ambassador Freeman became chairman for Projects International in 1995 after a distinguished 30-year career in U.S. diplomacy, which included positions as ambassador to Saudi Arabia and Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. He also acted as the principal American interpreter during President Nixon's 1972 visit to Beijing, as well as serving as Deputy Chief of Mission at the American Embassy in Beijing from 1981 to 1984. He is the author of the recent book, Interesting Times, China, America, and the Shifting Balance of Prestige. Welcome, Ambassador Freeman.
Glad to be here.
We're also happy to welcome Dr. Don Murphy, a visiting assistant professor of political science at George Washington University. Dr. Murphy has served as a postdoctoral research fellow with the Princeton-Harvard China and the World program, a visiting scholar with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing, China, as a visiting research fellow with the American University in Cairo, Egypt, and as a visiting researcher at Stellenbosch University's Center for China Studies in South Africa. Dr. Murphy is in the process of writing a book titled Rising Revisionist, China's Relations with the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa in the Post-Cold War Era. Dr. Murphy, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Syria has been in a state of civil war for nearly 2 years, but recent events have focused global attention on the war-torn country. Evidence of a chemical weapons attack outside Damascus in late August led to calls for military action from the U.S. and several other Western countries. President Obama's administration is convinced that the Syrian government was behind the attack and thus in violation of international norms.
Assad's government gassed to death over 1,000 people, including hundreds of children.
Meanwhile, China has supported Russia's government in rejecting calls for Western intervention of any sort in the Syrian conflict. Currently, China and Russia are seen by the U.S. as the main barriers to UN action against the Assad regime. Russia is an ally of Syria and has both economic and political interests in seeing Assad's government maintain control. Could you help us understand what stake China has in Syria and why it is continue to side with Russia in blocking UN action against the Assad regime? And we'll start with you, Ambassador Freeman.
Yeah, I think for the Chinese this is mainly what I would call an order-setting issue. That is, the old world order, which was one very much dominated first by U.S.-Soviet contention and then more recently by the United States as a unilateral actor, is passing. And the question is, what order will replace it? And the Chinese do not want that order to include reaffirmation of the Libyan precedent, which, as they see it, was a UN resolution authorizing a very limited intervention for humanitarian purposes, which was then distorted and expanded into open effort at regime change, which succeeded, leaving Libya in anarchy. They do not want to see this precedent applied in the case of Syria. In part, that's because they have their own strong interest in maintaining the Westphalian notion of absolute sovereignty. And they don't want others to interfere, as they have in the past, in their internal affairs. So they're quite strong on this point. And this gives them a common cause with Russia, which is the other element in their policy. They want to be on the same side as the Russians on this issue because Russia is their northern neighbor, and they have cultivated a very close relationship with it. So they don't have specific interests in Syria so much as interests in how Syria is handled, the process, the role of the United Nations, and their own relationships, particularly with Moscow.
Dr. Murphy?
Yes, I agree actually with Ambassador Freeman's assessment that the most important reason that China has an interest in this situation is around the principles of sovereignty and adhering to non-interference in the domestic affairs of countries within the Middle East and around the world. And I do think that there's a striking difference now as this world order is changing in some ways after the global financial crisis, and especially after the beginning of the Arab Spring, that China's views around this issue are actually hardening, and you see that with the vetoes in the Security Council. So part of it is a principled stand as opposed to Russia's much stronger economic and military interests in the country. I also agree with Ambassador Freeman that showing support for Russia is incredibly important for China in this emerging multipolar world. I do think also they get a side benefit of supporting Iran in some ways by having support for one of their allies, and general stability in the Middle East. I do think, and I know we're going to talk a lot about China's interests in the broader region, but China may not have strong interests in Syria itself, but the Syrian conflict turning into a regional event is of much more concern to them, and they want to avoid that happening. And I think they're concerned that intervention could actually blow this situation up.
If I can just add something to that, one of the principal interests the Russians have is in not seeing Syria become a base for Islamist terrorism and political Islam. Russia has a very substantial Islamic minority which is growing, and it has internal problems in places like Chechnya and Dagestan and in the Caucasus more generally. The Chinese share that interest too, to the extent it bears on their own ethnic minorities who are Muslim and restive, for example, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. So I think the two, again, have sort of broad global concerns in common rather than specific interests in Syria.
Mm-hmm. Now, right now, there's been a lot of talk about a potential diplomatic solution of a way to handle the chemical weapons attack, with potentially Assad handing over his chemical weapons supply to the UN. Obviously, this is going to take a lot of negotiation in the UN Security Council. And I think there's a perception in the US that Russia is the main opponent of action and that China is just going to more or less follow the Russian stance, so that Obama needs to work mainly with Russia to resolve this issue. Do you think that's true, or could US-China cooperation also be a route to getting action in the UN Security Council on this?
Well, it's early days. The Russians, Mr. Putin, have just served a fast ball over the net to President Obama, and it's up to him to return it to Russia, not to China. The proposal to sequester the Syrian chemical arsenal is, of course, a new idea. There are some 60 different depots in which chemical weapons are held in Syria. Collecting them will not be easy, especially because what's happened in Syria with the government paralleling the disunity, the fractured nature of the opposition, some 1,200 groups in the opposition. What's happened in the government is a process that some people call militiafication. This is the creation of militias, strongmen, overlords, warlords, baronies, people who are with the regime in a sense, but are defending local communities who happen to feel that they're better off under the regime than they would be under its Islamist opposition. These are Christians, these are Alawites, these are Druze, these are secular Muslims who fear the fanaticism of much of the opposition. So one of the problems is that if you bomb Syria and you attack its command and control system, you actually end up dispersing control over the chemical weapons to these local warlords and groups. And it is entirely possible that Assad did not order the use of weapons, in fact opposed it, but some local commander acting on his own in the context of a disintegrating command and control structure went ahead and did it. It's also possible, although less likely, that the opponents of the regime staged an incident. So collecting all these weapons, putting them under central control first, and then transferring that control to some international organization, first to the Russians perhaps, and then to others, is going to be a very complex process. And people who think this can be resolved in the near term are frankly very unrealistic. What role China might play in all of this? China is a principal contributor to UN peacekeeping forces generally, in line with its own interest in strengthening the UN system. Weak countries like the protection of the rule of law and seek safety in numbers, and China is in that mode at the moment. So they might actually play an important role in implementation, but I don't think they will be the architects. I think that will be worked out primarily between us and the Russians.
Dr. Murphy?
I agree. I think Russia will be taking the lead. I do think China's more important to the equation than a lot of, the American media emphasizes, in that they could play a constructive role even in the original architecture of the agreement, but I don't think they're going to take the lead, and I don't think that an agreement would be reached between the U.S. and Russia and then China's going to veto. I think China will be on board and should be utilized as a constructive partner in that process.
There's a very important point here. I think the United States, the president, got himself into the terrible corner he's in by making a number of mistakes. The first of these was at the outset of the rebellion, which began as civil disturbances in Syria around April of 2011. At the outset, he said, Assad will go, he must go. And so this became all about regime change. That immediately destroyed any possibility of cooperation from either China or Russia. Whether they would have been prepared or would still be prepared to use force against the use of chemical weapons is another question. So I agree with Dawn. I think that the Chinese will probably go along with the Russians, but I think it's important to realize that from the point of view of both of them, there is an important issue at stake, namely the United States acting in the name of the international community but not authorized by it should not go around changing governments at will. And if we can get away from that, if we can focus on the chemical weapons issue alone, then I think the prospects for cooperation go up.
Now, you mentioned that if we return the focus to chemical weapons, we might see different outcome, and obviously we're still waiting on the results of the UN investigation. So if, hypothetically, the UN investigation returned with the conclusion that Assad's government had been responsible, do you think that would change China's stance? Would China be willing to support some sort of action against the Syrian regime?
I think you have to think about what does action mean, because there's many different actions that could occur. I don't think they necessarily would support military action against Syria, even if it was proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the government had engaged in that. Economic sanctions, perhaps, that type of action they could be open to. Definitely, statements against the regime for using these weapons that, in general, the international community does not accept the use of. Yes, so, but I think right now what they really want is to come to this diplomatic solution and avoid the military question altogether. But even as they start, if we get past this initial hurdle and there's actual negotiations about the content of the resolution and how Syria will be treated, I do think both Russia and China will work to take the teeth out of that type of resolution. They're not going to want some sort of automatic trigger for military action or incredibly stringent economic sanctions.
Question is, what are we trying to accomplish? If it is to make the use of chemical weapons illegitimate, it's rather late in the game. They were extensively used between Iran and Iraq in the Iran-Iraq War. They were used by Saddam Hussein, apparently, in his north against Kurds. Chemical weapons banned by the international community, white phosphorus, for example, were used extensively in the Israeli battering of Gaza in 2006. They've also were used by us at Fallujah in Iraq. So it's rather odd. And by the way, the 1925, I think it was 1925, Geneva Convention on this wasn't actually adhered to by us until the early 1970s. So it's rather late. I mean, I think it would be worthwhile to try to establish that norm and to set up an international mechanism for enforcing it. But I don't think the world is going to go along with the United States arrogating to ourselves the unilateral responsibility for enforcing it. And to that extent, the Chinese and the Russians are with the majority, not in a minority internationally on this.
So with China's non-interventionist policy, it seems unlikely that they're ever going to view themselves in the role that the U.S. currently views itself, as an international security provider, as a potentially unilateral enforcer of international norms. So when China is viewing its relationship to the Middle East, how does it see itself functioning? What is China's role, both now and its ideal role in the future, in the Middle Eastern region? Because it seems like that's going to be very different from the U.S.'s role.
Okay. You go ahead.
Okay. At a very broad level, I would break it down into 4 primary areas. Because I think first you have to look at what are China's interests, and then what role do they want to play as a result of those interests. So the first major interest, I would say, is economic engagement, both for resources, but also for markets in the region broadly. And so if you look at what's happened over the last few years, China has surpassed the U.S. in 2011 in imports from the Middle East broadly, but mostly oil and energy resources. China next month, it's estimated, is going to exceed the U.S. as the #1 global net oil importer in the world, much earlier than other estimates had predicted. And as far as Chinese exports to the region and markets, they exceeded the U.S. In 2008. So right now, China is the most important economic partner for the Middle East, and most of their interests revolve around that and stability in that region to support those interests. Mm-hmm. The second most important interest, I would say, is gaining support from countries in the Middle East in this emerging multipolar world that Ambassador Freeman already spoke about. But China has really worked hard to build positive relations with basically all the countries in the Middle East. And they see developing countries and countries in the Middle East as part of a community that could support China going forward in the international arena. The third major interest, Ambassador Freeman already talked about, ensuring that domestic insurgency, which is related to Muslim causes in China, ensuring that states in that region don't support, whether via material resources or even ideological support, that they don't provide support to specifically Uyghurs in Xinjiang, but other Muslim minorities as well. And finally, I think China does have a vested interest in supporting developing country causes more broadly. In the past, this was around supporting third world countries and insurgencies in the region. More recently, it's more of this north-south divide and having allegiance with southern countries and non-Western countries in general. So they have these broad interests, right? But it's mostly economic and political. And I think that they want their role in that region to be economic and broadly political in a positive way, not wanting to intervene and change regimes necessarily. They just want stability. On the military side, their only military interest is to ensure commerce continues. So you see the operation in the Gulf of Aden for anti-piracy. You see their participation in peacekeeping initiatives in Lebanon and a little bit in Syria recently. But that's their only military involvement, and I think they really want to keep that aspect of interaction to a minimum and for as long as possible rely on the U.S. protecting that. That said, with fracking in the U.S. and the direction that we're supposedly going towards energy independence and what we've seen in the last few years, if U.S. interests decrease in the Middle East, China may need to step in and take a more active role.
I think there's some very interesting parallels between the foreign policy of the United States for the first 150 years or so of our existence and the Chinese approach. You could actually use the same words that Thomas Jefferson used in describing U.S. policy, or George Washington: freedom and friendship and commerce with all, entangling alliances with none, to describe Chinese policy. It's very self-interested. Some would say selfish, but not interested in assuming burdens without very good reason. The Chinese interest in the Middle East, as the U.S. interest originally was mainly in securing energy access. They don't have the complicating factor that we do of a protective relationship with Israel. And they don't have the recent history of military intervention and assertion of interests on our part separate from those of the countries in the region. So I think they will stand back as long as they can, very much aware and a little bit uncomfortable with the fact that to the extent that military protection is required, they are dependent on the U.S. Navy to preserve freedom of navigation. And it's worth noting that our Navy first developed its capability for global power projection in response to the Barbary pirates in North Africa. So piracy, in the case of the Somalis, has drawn the Chinese into a role they probably would not have wanted to get into, but out of self-interest they found themselves compelled to do so. And I suppose that kind of dragging in of the Chinese as they become more powerful and more engaged commercially and otherwise with the region is going to continue, but not according to some plan on their part in response to events.
And you mentioned that China is trying to maintain positive ties with countries in the region. Has China's response to the Syria uprising and the previous uprisings that were called the Arab Spring in Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, has China's response lost it any goodwill in the region from not intervening, from allowing these humanitarian crimes to take place?
I think it's a mixed picture. Certainly the so-called Arab Spring, not a term I would use, I think I would describe it as Arab uprisings. I don't think the purpose was democratization. It was some form of self-determination, both within the national framework and internationally. A more assertively Arab approach to issues. I think that really rather scared the Chinese. It seemed initially, and it was characterized by the Western press, which they read and believe all too often, I think, as some sort of wave of democratization, another set of color revolutions of the sort that had happened in the former Soviet space. And China's an autocracy. It's run by a monopoly political organization, the Chinese Communist Party, and they were a little scared. So I think that endeared them to the autocracies in the Middle East. In the Gulf, for example, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, others, Qatar, who, whether they're enlightened or not, are run by autocratic systems. It didn't endear them to the street in Egypt or in Tunisia. Then we come to another issue, which is that when they opposed the intervention by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and other countries in Syria, they lost a lot of points with the ruling families in those places because they were seen now not to be a reliable supporter of Saudi, Qatari foreign policy, UAE foreign policy. And their relationship with Turkey, which is another actor, has been somewhat ambivalent, not particularly warm. So I think it's very much a mixed picture.
I agree. I mean, I think you have to look at different levels of society. So at the elite level versus popular level, there's different perceptions. But even in the case of Egypt, although the Arab Street may have some negative perceptions, Morsi's first visit outside the region was to China, and he was attempting to build a relatively strong relationship with China. Specifically on Syria, I do think after the initial vetoes that both Saudi and Qatar and some other Gulf states were quite concerned about that. I think, though, in the longer term that it's more an irritant in relations rather than a game changer. I think the Saudis in general tend to be cautious about China. They didn't even establish diplomatic relations till 1990. If you look historically, there were concerns about an atheist communist regime ruling the country. So I don't think they're natural friends necessarily, but they are very strong economic partners now. And China is the leading customer for Saudi oil right now, and that likely will continue. So I think that there was kind of a blip in relations, that things are warming up a bit. I think each time we have a situation like we have in the last few weeks with the chemical weapons attack, and China again doesn't support the Saudi position, you may have irritants, but I don't think it's going to damage long-term relations with the Gulf states. And I think the Arab Street is mixed in that there's concern over China's lack of support, but a lot of the Arab Street's looking for an alternative to the U.S. and is not particularly enthusiastic about the role the U.S. is playing, so China provides an alternative, possibly.
I agree with all that, and the last point is very interesting and important. That is, the countries in the region reflecting changes in the world order toward a more pluralistic system and discomfort with their overdependence in the past on the United States, now that the United States asserts our own agenda, which sometimes differs from theirs. They're looking to dilute that dependence on the United States, to diversify their international relationships. And they've looked in this regard to China, to India, a little bit to Russia, although now they're at odds with Russia on Syrian issues. And they've looked to Brazil and Germany and others who have not been traditional actors in the Middle East, or not for a long time. And I think they've been very frustrated by the Chinese unwillingness to commit on a variety of issues, whether it's Iran or Syria or Egypt, and the Chinese desire to maintain friendships with all sides, Israel included, and not to become aligned in one direction or another. That's frustrating, and it illustrates the fact that to the extent China is becoming involved in the Middle East, it's more that they're being pulled into the Middle East and that they're pushing aggressively for a role where they haven't had one.
Mm-hmm. And we just have a little bit of time left, but to help us really clarify what China's actions might be, I think it's helpful to understand what result they would want. So could you explain for us what China's ideal world, what the conclusion would be to this Syrian crisis?
Well, we are talking about Syria, and I think the desirable result from their point of view is no military assault on Syria of a unilateral nature. The Syrian issue being put into a global international community context, meaning the United Nations. No affirmation of the Libyan precedent, no affirmation of the so-called responsibility to protect R2P principle. And Syria, which is brought to domestic tranquility by some sort of political process rather than a military one. A Syria that emerges that is not dominated by Islamist forces or aggressive about that internationally.
Dr. Murphy?
I agree in general. I do also think that Assad having a decisive military victory over his opponents could possibly also be okay for China, because I do think they're uncomfortable with what could replace Assad if the insurgency ultimately wins. But I agree in the short term with Ambassador Freeman. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much for helping us understand a very complex international issue. It was a pleasure to have you on the show, and obviously we'll keep an eye on unfolding events as they occur. And thank you for joining us at home. We'll see you next week on China Forum.